Work. Sight translation combines interpretation and translation. The interpreter must render the source language document to the target language, as if it were written in the target language. Sight translation occurs, usually, but not exclusively, in judicial and medical work. Consecutive interpretation may be the chosen mode when bilingual listeners are present who wish to hear both the original and interpreted speech, or where, as in a court setting, a record must be kept of both. When no interpreter is available to interpret directly from source to target, an intermediate interpreter will be inserted in a relay mode, e.g. a Greek source language could be interpreted into English and then from English to another language. This is also commonly known as double interpretation. Triple interpretation may even be needed, particularly where rare languages or dialects are involved. Such interpretation can only be effectively conducted using consecutive interpretation. Simultaneous interpretation (SI) suffers the disadvantage that if a person is performing the service, the interpreter must do the best he or she can within the time permitted by the pace of source speech. However, they also have the advantages of saving time and not disturbing the natural flow of the speaker. SI can also be accomplished by software where the program can simultaneously listen to incoming speech and speak the associated interpretation. The most common form is extempore SI, where the interpreter does not know the message until he or she hears it. Simultaneous interpretation, using electronic equipment where the interpreter can hear the speaker's voice as well as the interpreter's own voice, was introduced at the Nuremberg trials in 1945. The equipment facilitated large numbers of listeners, and interpretation was offered French, Russian, German, and English. The technology arose in the 1920s and 1930s when American businessman Edward Filene and British engineer Alan Gordon Finlay developed simultaneous interpretation equipment with Monsieur Yvon Kapp attended a conference with simultaneous translation in 1935 in the Soviet Union. As it proved successful, IBM was able to sell the equipment to the United Nations, where it is now widely used. In the United Nations Interpretation Service, in the ideal setting for oral language, the interpreter sits in a soundproof booth and speaks into a microphone, while clearly seeing and hearing the source language speaker via earphones. The simultaneous interpretation is rendered to the target language listeners via their earphones. The progressive shift from consecutive to simultaneous. Pavel Polozhenko's My Years with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, the memoir of a Soviet interpreter, gives a short history of modern interpretation and of the transition from its consecutive to simultaneous forms. He explains that during the 19th century, interpreters were rarely needed during European diplomatic discussions. These were routinely conducted in French, and all government diplomats were required to be fluent in this language. Most European government leaders and heads of state could also speak French. Historian Harold Nicholson attributes the growing need for interpretation after World War I to the fact that U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George were no linguists at the time. The concept and special equipment needed for simultaneous interpretation, later patented by Alan Gordon Finlay, had not been developed, so consecutive interpretation was used. Consecutive interpreters, in order to be accurate, used a specialized system of note-taking which included symbols, abbreviations, and acronyms because they waited until the speaker was finished to provide translation. The interpreters then had the difficult task of creating from these notes as much as half an hour of free-flowing sentences closely matching the speaker's meaning. Polozhenko cites Anton Velman, Gene Herbert and the Kaminker brothers as skilled interpreters, and notes one unusual case in which Andrei Kaminker interpreted a speech by a French diplomat who spoke for 2.5 hours without stopping. After World War II, simultaneous interpretation came into use at the Nuremberg trial and began to be more accepted. Experienced consecutive interpreters asserted that the difficulties of listening and speaking at the same time, adjusting for differences in sentence structure between languages, and interpreting the beginning of a sentence before hearing its end, would produce an inferior result. As well, these interpreters, who to that point had been prominent speakers, would now be speaking invisibly from booths. In 1951, when the United Nations expanded its number of working languages to 5, English, French, Russian, Chinese and Spanish, consecutive translation became impractical in most cases, and simultaneous translation became the most common process for the organization's large meetings. Consecutive interpretation, which provides a more fluent result without the need for specialized equipment, continued to be used for smaller discussions. Whispered since time immemorial. Whispering interpretation has been used, known in the trade by the French term chuchotage, to avoid disturbing the original speaker and those present listening to the original speaker. The interpreter's voice is kept at a low volume. To do this, the interpreter and the person requiring interpretation must sit or stand in close proximity to one another. No actual whispering is involved, as this is difficult to decipher as well as being too much of a strain on the voice. The interpreter uses normal, voiced speech at a low volume. Only one or at the most two people in need of interpretation can be accommodated, unless portable electronic equipment is used. This form of interpretation puts a strain on the interpreter, who has to sit for long periods leaning towards the person in need of interpretation. Types: conference. E-interpreting refers to interpretation at a conference or large meeting, either simultaneously or consecutively. The advent of multilingual meetings has reduced the amount of consecutive interpretation in the last 20 years. Conference interpretation is divided between two markets: institutional and private. International institutions, EU, UN, EPO, etc., which hold multilingual meetings, often favor interpreting several foreign languages into the interpreter's mother tongues. Local private markets tend to have bilingual meetings, the local language plus another, and the interpreters work both into and out of their mother tongues. These markets are not mutually exclusive. The International Association of Conference Interpreters, AIIC, is the only worldwide association of conference interpreters. Founded in 1953, its membership includes more than 2,800 professional conference interpreters in more than 90 countries. Judicial, legal, or court interpreting occurs in courts of justice, administrative tribunals, and wherever a legal proceeding is held, i.e., a police station for an interrogation, a conference room for a deposition, or the locale for taking a sworn statement. Legal interpreting can be the consecutive interpretation of witnesses' testimony, for example, or the simultaneous interpretation of entire proceedings by electronic means for one person or all of the people attending. In a legal context, where ramifications of misinterpretation may be dire, accuracy is paramount. Teams of two or more interpreters, with one actively interpreting and the second monitoring for greater accuracy, may be deployed. The right to a competent interpreter for anyone who does not understand the language of the court, especially for the accused, in a criminal trial, is usually considered a fundamental rule of justice. Therefore, this right is often guaranteed in national constitutions, declarations of rights, fundamental laws establishing the justice system, or by precedents set by the highest courts. However, it is not a constitutionally required procedure in the United States that a certified interpreter be present at police interrogation. This has been especially controversial in cases where illegal immigrants with no English skills are accused of crimes in the U.S. depending upon the regulations and standards adhered to per state and venue. Court interpreters usually work alone when interpreting consecutively, or as a team when interpreting simultaneously. In addition to practical mastery of the source and target languages, thorough knowledge of law and legal and court procedures is required of court interpreters. They are often required to have formal authorization from the state to work in the courts, and then are called certified court interpreters. In many jurisdictions, the interpretation is considered an essential part of the evidence. Incompetent interpretation, or simply failure,